okay, people have gone, they've left the house, they took the dogs. I think I actually might be able to do this today. Okay, so we're gonna pick up where we left off from last time. Everything's gonna be fine, good and dandy. Okay, so nationalism and propaganda. We were talking about how all this stuff affected World War I. We were talking about how the European rivals were trying to maintain this power balance, but it actually didn't do anything because it was really bad. There was actually a power struggle, and it was just all lies. Terrible lies, children. Terrible lies. Okay, so one thing you have to remember is that nationalism, like I said, is kind of, in the last video, is like a very toxic form of patriotism. So technically, if you think about it, it can really unify powerful nations, but in weaker nations, it was dividing everybody. Because they're like, well, if they're really powerful, then obviously, because I'm not very powerful like them, then I'm going to do very bad, and it's not going to go well, and I'm beneath everybody else. And that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened. It was very bad. So there were a lot of regions that were pretty tense. The worst region, though, that was like super, super tense, and they were pretty much just going after each other, and they were also going after the big empires, which, if you understand, it doesn't make sense to do that. It's fine. It was the Balkans. Now, when I say the Balkans, as you can tell by this square right here, this is kind of focusing in on the Balkan territory, but it encompasses Serbia, Greece, Albania, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now, these specific countries actually broke away from the Ottoman Empire. We talked about that in one of the other units, how Greece broke away from the Ottoman Empire. Well, so did all these other countries. And they were trying to create their own nations, which sounds great. It really does. But the problem with that, if you are not used to being a stable nation, like independently, then you are going to run into the problem of money. You don't have an empire like paying taxes, so you have to make sure you are financially stable. There is no safety net now. That safety net is gone. So that's what a lot of these countries, the Slavic countries, are running into. When I say Slavs, this is like an ethnicity. It's a group of people from these different regions. So we have Russia. This is a big one. It's like everybody's just a Slav. And then we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then we also have Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bulgaria is a big one. Serbia is huge. Serbia is important. Ooh, Serbia is important. And then we have Albania, Montenegro, all that stuff. So, and it's all like shown to you on the graph with the orange striped stuff. I don't know. Anyway, so the Slavic people in Serbia, they wanted to unify all the Slavs. Like, all this, like, orange stripe area, they wanted to unify them and make their own empire, the Slavic Empire. But that wasn't going to work out very well because Austria-Hungary, this empire right here, they did not want to give up their Slavic territories, because their Slavic territories, as you could see right here, they're pretty big. Oh, my dogs are back. It's fine. The biggest territory was Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, they, like I said, didn't want to give it up. And if you look at it, I mean, that's a pretty big landmass. And the reason why they didn't want to give it up is because of the fact that they're going to be losing taxpayers. They're going to be losing money, right? And, I mean, think about it. All the major wars in history, even small wars, 90% of the reasons, money and territory. That's it. So the Balkans, that whole territory, became what's been known as like a powder keg. So it's like waiting for a spark to make it blow up and to ignite. So very, very tense. And it's also kind of, this is when we're getting closer, right? Because this is around 1910, right? And fun fact, in 1912, children, the Titanic sank. Yay! Lots of people died. Sorry, that was dark. But anyway, the Titanic sank in 1912, April 12th, 1912, I think. Okay, so the outbreak of World War I. This is huge. So Serbians, the people that wanted to unify all the Slavic nations, they vowed to take Bosnia and Herzegovina from Austria-Hungary. Problem. Big problem. On June 28, 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated along with his wife by a Serbian terrorist. Now, here's an interesting little story. The terrorist, his name was Gavrilo Princip. He was sent to assassinate him, right? The Franz Ferdinand. And he actually, at the first attempt, he missed him. Okay? And because he was so upset that he missed his target, he went into a cafe in like the downtown area. I'm assuming it looks pretty, like, it's just cobble streets, whatever. That was rambling. But he goes into a cafe and he gets a sandwich. And then the Archduke and his wife are going down the street in a car, which is kind of what you're seeing in this side. And as he turns from purchasing his sandwich, he then sees the Duke and his wife out, and he's like, "Oh, my chance!" So he goes. This is not, it's not a laughing matter, but he goes out and then he shoots them both in the car. So yay, terrorism. Okay, so on July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, and an ultimatum is essentially when you say to someone, you're going to do this or I'm going to do that. And so what Austria-Hungary told Serbia, they're like, listen, you're going to turn over all conspirators, people that were all in cahoots with the assassination, and allow us to investigate, or we're going to go to war. Serbia was like, crickets, not happening. So they obviously didn't want that to happen, because that was going to have people arrested from their country. They were going to allow another country to take over. That they didn't want that. So on the 28th of July in 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Now, Russia, right, this is important. Russia had a large population of Slavs and was actually an ally of Serbia. So Russia, ally of this country right here, Serbia. Okay, so Russia moved their troops to the Austrian border right here. So, and I mean, look at this landmass. And like I said, that entire country, that they're all Slavic ethnicity. That's the motherland, literally. So after they moved their troops to the border, it was putting pressure on Austria-Hungary. And people were getting killed. There were a lot of, like I said, nationalism and patriotism infused, like, hate crimes in a way. And these events, most specifically the assassination right there, this is what kicked off World War I. On your tests, when you are covering World War I, it always kicks off with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Now, finally we get to the beginning of World War I. Everything's starting to be declared, like, I hate this country can suck it, so we're going to declare war. Woo! The thing about this, which I think I went into depth the last video, is that if you look at Europe, right? I mean, right here, you have this picture, right? All these different countries. The reason why it's such a massive scale war is because everything is connected. This entire section of the world is connected. And if they're not connected, they're not separated by massive oceans like we are versus them, right? Europe is so easily traversed by other countries. Like I can even go from England over here onto the mainland. It's like a 2-hour flight, not even, depending on where you're going. From France, it's a 2-hour train ride underwater. It's fun. I've been. Love it. So this is why the war was on such a massive scale, and it was declared a world war after so many years. It was like this. It was an entire section of the world. So yeah, World War. It was called the Great War because it was like nothing anyone had ever seen, right? I mean, you couldn't go anywhere without tension, without being identified as either an enemy, a traitor, or, possibly an ally if you're lucky, if you walk into the right country. So just to kind of understand what the tensions were, what the emotions were of the people at this time, I know that ramble took a while, but essentially that's kind of why it became known as World War I. So it sucked. But anyway, here we go. So Russia mobilized for war to protect Serbia, and then on the 28th of July, Serbia did, like I said, decline the ultimatum. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and its ally Russia. Now, if you ask me, that wasn't very smart, because look at Austria-Hungary and then look at Russia. It's big. But Austria realized that if they declared war on Serbia, that they would have to technically declare war on Russia. The only thing that it had going for it was that Austria's allies were all connected right here. It's like this pocket. Whereas Russia's secondary allies were France and Great Britain at the time. But what gets added is later Serbia. And then on August 1st in 1914, Germany declared war on Russia because Germany is the ally of Austria-Hungary. And then on the 3rd, Germany decided to declare war on France. Can't imagine why. On August 4th, 1914, England declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary because they're like, hey, you can't attack my friend. This is like the whole bully in the playground area. If you're friends with somebody and then this bully comes over and shoves your friend to the ground, you are not going to just sit there and deal with it. You are going to go after that bully and you are going to push them to the ground. And, well, I'm not encouraging violence, but I'm just saying, like, you're going to defend your friend, right? Duh. So, anyway, then Italy backed out of its agreement with Germany and Austria-Hungary and joined the Allies. Okay, so I know that I can't do a color merge, but if I could, Italy would go from joining Germany and Austria to then join blue with England. And, sorry, that was a horrible noise. England would then gain Italy. England, France, they'd all gain Italy. So this, right, they're all declaring war on one another. This is really where World War I is truly in full swing now. And as you can see now, the front. Whenever you hear the term the front, it's like the front lines, that whole idea. This is where the fighting, they kind of just merge. And this is where everyone kind of shows up. So you have the Eastern Front, which is very obvious to see, right? You have Russia, you have Austria, and Germany. Okay, so you are definitely going to have the Eastern Front here. The Italian Front, obviously right in this little cul-de-sac pocket area of Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And then you have the Western Front. This is the trench line. We're going to actually dissect the trenches, and I'm so sad that I can't be in the classroom for the trenches because I was going to do a really fun class activity. It was going to be awesome, but it's okay. So as you can see, this is where a lot of different countries would kind of show up, and by the different dates, these are different battles that are going on. Like the Battle of Verdun. Big one. So during the war, Germany and Austria became the Central Powers, and they were joined later by Bulgaria and then the Ottoman Empire. Now, when we were talking about the Gunpowder Empires, we talked about the Ottoman Empire. They were pretty much very powerful, very good allies to have in wartime until after this war. And don't worry, we'll talk about how the Ottoman Empire fell and it became weak and fledgling and terrible and starving. The members of the Triple Entente, which we talked about, became known as the Allied powers. Now, the Triple Entente at the time was just England, France, and at the time it was Russia, but then everything kind of just after that, after they all started declaring war on each other. But the Triple Entente was known as the Allies. Now, the Allies, this term is used again in World War II. We're going to have the Allied powers, which we were part of, and then you're going to have the Axis powers, which then will encompass countries like Germany and then Japan and other stuff like that. Now, like I said, the members of the Triple Entente, like I said, became known as the Allied powers and eventually were joined by many nations throughout the world. Now, if you look at this little graph, now the color coding, horrible, but the blue, okay, the blue, I want this purple lavendery color. These are the Allied powers. I want you to look at this map and really see how strong the Allied forces were, okay? So we are part of the Allies. Canada, half of South America, 90% of Africa. You want to know why? Imperialism. England and France on half of it. And then we have China, Russia, India, Australia. They were all part. These massive. The half the globe is purple, right? They're all allies. Then you had the Central Powers, which were Germany and Austria-Hungary. You had the Ottoman Empire, which at the time it's kind of shrinking. It looks pretty small on the map, which is when we kind of start to see it's getting divided. Because remember, I told you, the Ottoman Empire lost 6 countries worth of people to it, so it lost a lot of territory and it shrank. Then you have neutral territory. These are people all the way up in the Arctic Circle that can't be bothered. They're dealing with penguins. They don't care about war. All right, so fighting in World War I. From 1817 No. From 1870 to 1914, the growth of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism increased all the tensions. And this is where we start to get all the fighting. People are joining from everywhere. After the assassination, nationalism amongst the Slavs and the Balkans, that's kind of what led to all of that. Now, the conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary were triggered alliances, and like I said, this was the start, and the power started to shift after this. So, so Europe before the outbreak, right? Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, everything's fine, and then after the war, you have the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. So these are just some interesting pictures that I have found in actually not just me, but these are stuff from Mrs. Kent that she's found, but they're in museums, they're on online documentations everywhere else. These are some French soldiers, these are some German recruits going off to war. They were actually pretty enthusiastic about the fighting. Most people anticipated the war would be over within that same year by Christmas. So in August 1914, it was the technical beginning, and then Christmas 1914, they thought it was all going to be done. Little did they know they had about 5 years to go. So when the war began, Germany's biggest problem was the potential of fighting on two separate fronts. Because remember, I showed you that this was the Eastern Front, and then over here was the Western Front. This is where all the trenches were. And we had serious battle, like the Battle of Verdun. So Germany's solution was the Schlieffen Plan, or the Schlieffen Plan. There we go. I said it correctly. So, which involved quickly defeating France in the West. Now, they are going to attack France not only in World War I very swiftly, but they're also going to successfully attack them again in World War II. This is all thanks to meth, my dear children. Don't worry, we'll talk about drugs later. Okay, so they were going to quickly defeat France in the West and then send troops to the East before Russia was actually fully mobilized for the war. And then the plan seemed to be working when the German army marched through Belgium and France within miles of Paris. So the German army was very quickly mobilized. This was, again, militarism, their standing power, they were ready to go. They were just waiting for the right opportunity. And then after they entered in through Paris, we had the English and the French. They actually saved Paris, and this was known as the Battle of Marne. And they were able to defeat France's capital, which is important because in World War II, once the Nazis rolled in and they took Paris, they were like, forget it, we're not fighting anymore. Like, we're not, because they didn't want to risk all the historical architecture in the city. Yep, that's exactly why. So meanwhile, Russia mobilized faster than expected, so Germany actually had to divert troops from France. So essentially what was going on is they were going to mobilize troops going this way, but then England uniting with France kind of surprised them, and they were like, oh crap, let's go back this way, and then they had to fight people on the Eastern Front, which was with Russia. Now, because the plan failed, the Central Powers were then forced to fight a two-front war, which I showed you in a couple slides back. But here's one, here's the Eastern Front, and then here's the Western Front. And like I said, this is where all the trenches were. The fighting between Germany and France was known as the Western Front, and then the fighting between Germany and Russia was known as the Eastern Front. Now, this is problematic for the Central Powers because they're being divided in half, and they have to fight these massive land masses. One, Russia, look at all the people that they have. Look at that. Plus, you had Serbia. You had all these people coming up from this direction, all the way up in through Greece, Bulgaria, everywhere. Romania was a big one too, and then you had the Western Front, so you had people coming all the way from the British Isles. France, Italy was a huge one, and then technically Switzerland was like neutral, but that doesn't mean every single person thought that way. It meant that their government and their ruling powers at the time declared that they were neutral. So you actually had people that were Swiss soldiers that joined and helped out their fellow Allied powers, or sometimes they went on the German side and they fought with them too. So by 1915, the war settled into a stalemate. So pretty much each side fortified their positions with trenches. Trench warfare really became what World War I was known for. So I've actually taken a picture of a trench and I've dissected it for you. So we're going to kind of go through this. So we're going to find A right here. Okay, so this whole section, this is the front line. Okay, so this is where the saps were, they were actually in the the shallower trenches. They were shallower trenches, and they allowed access to machine gun nests, grenade throwing positions, and observation posts. So this is kind of where they would build these apexes so they could like rain fire on the other side, which is over here. So then you had the support trench. So this is B right back in here. Because I feel like whenever, the only reason why I'm doing this is because I feel like whenever we tell you about trench warfare, the only imagery you have is like from one perspective on a movie screen if you've watched like Wonder Woman or something. But I think this is actually really interesting information. So this is the communication trenches. They were connected to 3 different kinds of, they actually connected all 3 of the trenches. And then you had C, which is back in here. This is the reserve trench. So this is where the heavy artillery fire came in. You had mortars, and they were to soften up the resistance before an infantry attack. And then over here in the enemy trench. So essentially what this was doing, C, back in here, they would have the mortars. They would go over this section in the middle, which is called no man's land. So this is whenever you're talking about, when you hear the phrase when they weren't gaining territory, they weren't gaining any movement, it's because of no man's land. Now, no man's land was set up with barbed wire, and it had about 25 yards to a mile wide of distance between the two forces. And so these were some problems facing the attacking troops. So you had aircrafts, which can actually warn the buildup of an enemy troop before an attack. So this essentially can give away to the attack. Yes, it's good because it's an easy way to save people and not like sacrifice a bunch of the foot soldiers' lives, but then normally what would happen is they kind of get ready for the attack coming in from this way, which was a normal tactic. No man's land. This was a huge problem because, like I said, nobody could cross it. It was, unless you're Wonder Woman, of course. But no man's land was turned up by a lot of shell fire and mud, which made it really hard to cross because you get stuck in it. Plus, you had the barbed wire on both sides, so that was also kind of problematic. And then you had the frontline dugouts, which they can protect people, but it's really not against direct and artillery shell hit because it's almost like a mini explosion. It's like, poof, and then that's just a massive hole for people to then funnel through. Barbed wire meters, or barbed wire were like meters deep, which proved to be a really impossible obstacle for troops to get through. And then, of course, the biggest problem was getting into the enemy trench, which is where the German dugouts could actually be 15 meters below the ground. Therefore, they were too well constructed to be damaged by any artillery fire anyway. So all the Germans had to do whenever the Allied forces were, sending their mortars over, sending their shells over, they just had to crawl into the dugouts, and they'd be okay. So these were a lot of problems facing the soldiers at the time. So here's actually a really cool picture of soldiers going over the trench, attempting to gain some territory. This guy probably got shot. And then we had so a lot of other issues that were being had by the soldiers. They had very little decent food. And what food they did have was often attacked by rats. So these rats were the size of small rabbits and badgers because they had fed on decomposing bodies of dead soldiers. That's pretty disgusting. So the dead soldiers would kind of just lay there. They really couldn't do much because if they were going to try and collect the dead bodies, they would then get shot because half the time people getting shot were in no man's land. And they couldn't leave the bodies dying in the trenches. They were going to have to throw them out over the side. It was really bad. It was really gross. So these rats were massive. They were really huge. It was, have you ever seen The Princess Bride? It's like ROUS's Rats of Unusual Size. You should definitely Google that movie. It's a great movie. Good thing to watch during quarantine time. And then we had trench foot. So, like in this region, Europe, if you've never been before, Europe rains a lot. The climate is very mild, and so these trenches were like a funnel for all this rainwater. And these soldiers would get what's called trench foot. This is a picture right here. It is disgusting. There's 2 different types of like water collection bacteria diseases that evolve from this. So you had trench foot, and then if they were moving anywhere in a humid climate, it was swamp foot. Now swamp foot thankfully didn't totally afflict them, but trench foot, as you can see, is pretty disgusting. Now, the new weapons that were actually invented to try and gain an advantage and win the war were the machine guns. The machine gun nests were probably one of the best inventions for artillery fire because, like I said, the shells from the heavy artillery, like the mortars, Germans could get away from that. And we could too. Like Allied forces had dugouts too. So it really wasn't doing any damage because all they had to do was just funnel out, crawl into the dugout, and then they'd be fine. But machine guns were a little different. they could put them in what's called the apex. So it's like you have like the triangle, right? And they could put them up here at the apex and then just move it. Because this gun was able to move up and down, and you could adjust the range. And it also was like a rapid fire weapon, which was a huge deal. The long range artillery, again, this is a big one. And then tanks. Now tanks were they were interesting during World War I. So the turrets were actually pretty full functioning, and then you had the people, as you can see right here, they could see out through the front side. Now they were sort of vulnerable for a little while, but then by the time we get into World War II, they were much more impenetrable at this time frame. So here's some fun cartoons of death, destruction by tanks. Yay. Okay, now we also had airplanes and zeppelins. Zeppelin, not the band, but zeppelins like the aircraft. They were flying. They were like these giant. It's like the Goodyear, like the blimps, right? So you had stuff like the Hindenburg. That's actually a bad thing. You should definitely Google the Hindenburg disaster because it's really interesting to talk about. But these were also essential because this was the air fire. This is the suppressing fire that they could actually provide at the time frame. Another big advantage was flamethrowers and then grenade launchers. Obviously we've updated the tech, but we use grenade launchers now. Flamethrowers, this was actually used a lot in Vietnam because of the dense vegetation that they had. It was just really fast. The flamethrowers were really new because of the liquid ignite, like the liquid napalm that they were using at the time, which was just really, really dangerous. Now, what's interesting is that there's a grenade that was actually found amongst a bag of potatoes at a Hong Kong chip factory. It was mistaken for a potato, and then they found an archaeologist like me, and we were able to tell the difference. Now, another big thing that happened in World War I was the biological warfare. So we had poison gas. If you guys have seen Wonder Woman, I know that it's about a superhero in a comic book, but it's actually pretty accurate to the development of all the gas, like the chemicals that they were using. So gas masks were pretty essential for our soldiers, and gas masks today are still problematic because it fogs up, it's so difficult to maneuver, it's all like this really crappy material because we have to go through these little gas chambers training. Like I had to do it. Granted, it was nothing that was going to murder me like that, but it was still like it sucks, it's terrible. But and the biggest worry was the chlorine gas, because the chlorine gas could pretty much eat through anything, and sometimes the masks were not enough. Another weapon that was developed was the submarine. Yay, hidden death in the water. So that was a nice one. So like I said, these were big, depending on who was using it, advantages and disadvantages. So one of my favorite quotes to remember for this is that men of peace will create engines of war, and then we have something on the scale of 8.5 million soldiers dying and 21 million became wounded. So yeah, these weapons were effective. Definitely. It's unfortunate. So here's some pictures of people that were wounded. They lost a lot of limbs. I'm surprised that they didn't lose like their lives because of the gangrenous, nasty. But then the fighting on the Western Front was actually able to slow to a stalemate. So thankfully, after they were injured like that, they were sent home because, what are they going to do? But the Western Front slowed to a stalemate, so neither side could gain advantage. Now, what that means is that they could not gain territory past no man's land. Wherever these trenches were, they really couldn't move any further. Now, the Germans, they actually stopped the Russian advances in 1914, but it doesn't last. So during the 10-month Battle of Verdun. Now, the Battle of Verdun alone was almost a year long. 10 months in 1916. 1 million soldiers were killed. 1 million in a battle. 1 million. Another 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of Somme. Now, this little graph kind of shows you, but this was progressively happening either kind of like right after one another. So you had one in 1916, you had one in 1915, and you had one in 19. The two biggest ones were happening at the same time, and they pretty much didn't stop. So from February to July, you had 1 million people killed in Verdun, and then from July to November, you had another 1 million people killed from July to November. Such short spans were just completely, I mean, 2 million people were killed in 2 battles. It's pretty intense. Now, despite the deaths, neither the Allies or the Central Powers gained an advantage after these battles. So, a lot of people could look back and go like, well, so 2 million people died in these battles for nothing. Well, it's not for nothing. They were fighting for a reason. They were trying to stop all the different advances being made by powers that were not making good decisions, by different political advances. So, but yeah, no, the sad part is that they did not gain any advantage. They didn't get any territory. On the Eastern Front, this is real the Russian part, they were struggling to hold against the German army. The German military was probably the most efficient during this time frame. Now, what's interesting, so the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, happening off the coast of Great Britain and Ireland, this is going to play a huge factor in when we are going to, kind of get interested in World War I. What's really interesting is that we have women training for combat for one of the first times in modern warfare history. So Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of Europe, and they failed to produce enough weapons or food. So millions of Russian soldiers and civilians died during the war. So not just soldiers, but you had civilians dying. And like I said, they didn't care who. Like, hey, man, woman, join. Doesn't matter. We need all the help we can get. So by 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. Right? They didn't have enough. In the Industrial Revolution, they were not a leading power. Okay, by any means. Whereas all the countries, if you look at it, all of these countries during the Industrial Revolution made a huge progression. Russia did not. So the stalemate on the Western and Eastern fronts turned World War I into a war of attrition, where each side tried to outproduce and outlast the enemy. This is going to happen again during the Cold War. It's the same idea, different times. So nations committed to total war to win World War I. So essentially, factories were converted to make more war equipment, industrial resources were rationed in order to prioritize military needs, and the governments used conscription to draft civilians into the military. So the draft was done, and then propaganda, of course, was used to maintain civilian support for the war, because if there's anything that we need to know, once the people feel like the war is lost, then for that side, morale will die. So overseas colonies were used to gain resources for additional soldiers. So this is kind of where, like I said, when you looked at the map and you saw all the different allied powers, and you're like, wow, that all these people were fighting against these, like, how did we not win? Well, it's because they were just owned by people that were allies, like Britain and France. We are using animals for the first time like this. This is pretty intense. We have elephants taking stuff to the front. So we have dogs, these massive dogs, and we also have women doing all the farming and the plowing, because men are gone. They've all been drafted. So the European colonies throughout Africa became a battlefield as the warring parties strike at one another's colonial positions. So essentially, while they're fighting over all this stuff, then they decide to push further and then fight here. The main fighting of the war occurs in the Western and Eastern fronts, but it still happens. Now, India provided about 1.3 million men to fight and work alongside the British rulers throughout Europe. Again, they were owned by them at the time, they were run by them, so that's kind of why that happened. Then Japan declares war on Germany in 1914, and they seize all the German colonies in China and the Pacific. So this itty bitty little island right here was able to take all the colonies that Germany owned over here and then down over here in the Pacific Ocean. Japan's military does not play. During the Industrial Revolution time frame, they also took advantage. We didn't really talk about them a whole lot, but one thing about Germany that became very interesting was that not only did they want to modernize and be on par with the rest of the world, they still had their samurai. They still had these old beliefs and these old styles of fighting still ingrained in their people. So they had almost, next to Germany, the most efficient type of military out there. Okay, so alliances, you had the allies and you had Central Powers. Now you're looking at all this stuff and you're like, man, I don't understand how all these allies could not take out this tiny list of like 4 Central Powers. Well, again, these Central Powers, they were very, very mobilized. That's the biggest thing. They were mobilized and they had the money to stick it out. So you actually had Turkish cavalry, and then you had Chinese soldiers that were involved in World War I, and you also had the Sikh British ones. These were from India. And so everybody, all the places claimed by imperialism, were involved in this world war. So, like I said, that entire section of the world was going to war with one another. Now, to keep Germany from trading with other nations, Britain used its navy to blockade Europe. Now, Germany responded by using unrestricted submarine warfare to attack the British Navy and any merchant ships supplying the Allies. That was awesome. Now, you see these dots everywhere? These are ships sunk by the German U-boats from 1916 to about 1917. So in a year, all of these ships were sunk by the Germans. Yay! Now, the German U-boat attacks played a huge role in bringing the USA into World War I. I told you that. Now, when World War I began in 1914, the United States wanted to remain neutral. However, by 1917, the USA was then pulled into the war. So, as a neutral nation, the USA was trying to trade with the Allies during the war, and then the German policy of the submarine warfare led to the attacks on the U.S. merchant ships and British passenger ships. So, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, demanded freedom of the seas. It's like, hey, stop sinking my people's ships. We're just trying to trade. Germany was like, suck it. So Americans were outraged, and then in May 1915, when a German U-boat sank the British ship Lusitania, it killed 1,200 people, and on that ship, amongst all the dead people, were 128 Americans. So, yeah, we were not happy about that. America's anger with Germany did increase in 1917 after the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. This is a huge thing. Normally on your EOCs, they talk in all the exams, they have full-on excerpts from the Zimmermann telegram. And then Germany knew that the U-boat attacks would actually bring the U.S. into war, and Germany proposed that Mexico should attack the U.S. in exchange for the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So what Germany was hoping to do was to kind of inspire Mexico to fight us from within, because we're connected, right? We're a connected landmass, so that would be very problematic. And then what Germany was trying to tell Mexico is we will, you fight, you help us win because we're fabulous. And then we're going to guarantee you the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back to you. Americans were like, that's nice, friend. Thanks. Appreciate that. So on April 2nd, 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, and they entered the war. Now, the arrival of millions of American soldiers in 1918 gave a huge boost to the Allies. I mean, a huge boost. In November of 1917, Russia signed a peace treaty, and they exited the war. They're like, look, we can't do this anymore. We're done. But in 1918, the Central Powers were running out of supplies and tried a huge attack on France. But the Allies halted the attack and then pushed them back. So essentially, Germany, once Russia peaced out, they were like, nope, we can't do it. We're going to die. We're all going to starve to death. Germany was like, ha 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 ha. So we're going to go in and try to take Paris like they tried to do in the Schlieffen plan. Oh, I love German. Anyway, so the S plan. They were going to try and take them. And then, but now, with the surge of Americans over there helping all of the different allies, we were able to push them back. And so Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered in October 1918. Now, if you notice, there's one country that still hasn't surrendered yet. Yep. So finally, though, on November 11th, so it took about another month, Germany agreed to an armistice, which is a ceasefire. They're like, okay, we're going to stop. And then World War I finally came to an end. Yay! No more death and destruction. At least so we thought for a little while. So this is kind of a little graph to show you all the deaths in World War. Now, as you can see, the Allies had a massive scale, but that's also because 90% of the people fighting were the Allies. This isn't important. This isn't important. This was supposed to be a class activity, and we didn't get to it. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because the next part is the Russian Revolution, which I think should be its own segment, but that was a super condensed crash course of World War I. I really hope that you guys enjoy it. Stay safe. Let me know if you need anything. We'll pick up, like I said, with the Russian Revolution. We'll see all the assassination of all these Russian people and families and see what Karl Marx can really do for you. Communism? Nothing. All right, so see you again, and hope everything's well.